Dustin Miller had always believed that his family farm was more than just a patch of land. It was a legacy. For generations, the Miller farm had provided sustenance and pride to a tight-knit community on the outskirts of rural Kansas. Today, Dustin, an independent farmer, dedicated husband, and local pillar of hard work, ran approximately 200 acres of fields, orchards, and a weathered red barn that told the story of his forefathers. Every furrow in the field and every creak of a barn door was a testament to a life defined by independence and tradition. For Dustin, the farm wasn't simply a business, it was his sanctuary, the one place where he could truly live by his own rules. When he rose at dawn to check on his crops or spent evenings on the wraparound porch watching the sunset over endless fields, he felt a deep connection to the land that no government mandate or corporate order could break. But all was not peaceful on the horizon. In recent years, a local homeowners association, HOA, had aggressively expanded its influence, reaching even into rural areas where its jurisdiction was never agreed upon. At the center of this overreach was Kerren Baxter, a self-proclaimed enforcer of community standards, with an attitude as overbearing as her perfectly tailored suit. Kerren, now the de facto president of the HOA, had built her reputation on handing out fines and issuing threats for even the most trivial deviations from her imagined ideal. Neighbors whispered that she fancied herself the arbiter of all that was proper, and she spared no expense to enforce her vision. One warm Saturday morning, as Dustin was inspecting the irrigation lines in one of his cornfields, a black sedan pulled up along the gravel drive leading to the farmhouse. Out stepped Kerren, clipboard in hand and a determined glare fixed on the horizon. With a clipped, businesslike tone, she announced, "Mr. Miller, I'm here on behalf of the HOA to inform you that your property is in violation of our community standards." Dustin paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm sorry, what violation?" he asked, puzzled. Kerren's eyes swept disdainfully over the picturesque scene, the time-worn barn, the untamed wildflowers bordering the driveway, and the fields stretching to the horizon. "Your farm's exterior, specifically, the unauthorized use of rustic decor and the outdated paint on your barn, does not conform to our prescribed aesthetic. You are in default for unpaid dues, which, by our records, you owe the community. I demand immediate action." Kerren thrust a thick envelope into his hand. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "Failure to settle these dues will result in foreclosure proceedings on your property." Dustin's eyes widened. He had never been part of any HOA. His farm was managed strictly by local agricultural and zoning laws. "I don't owe any dues. I'm not even a member of your HOA," he replied, his tone steady but laced with disbelief. Neighbors peered from behind fence posts and out of barn windows as Kerren's face reddened with indignation. "The rules apply to everyone in this district," she snapped. That first confrontation was a shock to Dustin, but it also lit a fire within him. He had built his life on the foundation of independence, and here was someone trying to extort him over unpaid dues for a system he never joined. Back inside his farmhouse later that day, Dustin spread the envelope out on his kitchen table beside faded family photographs and a well-worn ledger. As dusk fell and the golden light filtered through the windows, he began poring over local ordinances and property rights documents. It became increasingly clear that Kerren's demands were not only baseless, but an outright abuse of power. Determined not to be bullied, Dustin resolved then and there to fight back, not only to save his farm from a bogus foreclosure, but to expose the overreach of an HOA that had no business dictating how a family farm should be run. The stage was set for a long, hard-fought battle that would test his resolve, his knowledge of the law, and the unity of his rural community. The very next morning, Dustin woke to find another notice taped to his front door. This time the document was even more aggressive. Bearing the same embossed HOA seal and Kerren's signature, it listed unpaid dues that Dustin supposedly owed for failure to comply with community standards. The notice stated that if he did not remit payment within 10 days, foreclosure proceedings would be initiated. Its language was formal and foreboding. Failure to settle these dues shall result in immediate legal action and the initiation of foreclosure on your property. Stunned, Dustin read the notice aloud as he walked around his farmhouse. Unpaid dues? I'm not even in the HOA, he muttered under his breath. The absurdity of it all was clear. His farm had been in his family for generations and was governed solely by local agricultural codes and zoning laws, not by the arbitrary rules of an organization he had never joined. Within hours of the notice's appearance, 2 men in dark uniforms arrived on the property. Introducing themselves as compliance inspectors dispatched by the HOA, they carried clipboards and looked every bit the part of bureaucrats on a mission. Mr. Miller, one said, his tone rehearsed yet firm, we are here to inspect your property and verify your compliance with community standards. We require you to provide any documents necessary to settle your unpaid dues. Dustin, remaining calm, replied, my property is managed under local laws. I don't owe any dues because I'm not part of your HOA. I suggest you refer to the municipal code. The inspectors hesitated, exchanging puzzled glances. Before they could press further, Kerren's voice boomed from a nearby car through a loudspeaker. Remember, Mr. Miller, the rules apply to everyone, even if you're not officially a member. Outraged but composed, Dustin refused to be bullied. Later that day, he drafted a detailed email to the local zoning office and agricultural extension, attaching copies of the notices and photos of the inspectors on his property. He requested an official review of the HOA's claim and made clear that he was well within his legal rights. At dusk, Dustin posted a blog update on his community website, explaining the bizarre situation in his own measured, confident tone. I have never signed up for an HOA, and these dues are a sham. I stand by my right to manage my farm without interference, he wrote, and soon, comments from fellow farmers and neighbors flooded in, echoing his sentiments. By the time the sun set over the cornfields, Dustin had meticulously organized every piece of evidence, the notice, photographs, emails, into a growing dossier. Each document became proof that Kerren's overreach was not only unjustified but illegal. The battle had officially begun, and Dustin's determination was stronger than ever. In the days that followed, Kerren and the HOA escalated their campaign against Dustin. What had begun as a flimsy notice over unpaid dues quickly transformed into a full-scale intimidation tactic. Anonymous flyers began appearing around the community, warning that all properties in the district must conform to the HOA's standards or face severe legal consequences. The messages were uniform and unyielding. Failure to comply with community standards will result in foreclosure and additional fines. Late one afternoon, as Dustin was repairing a broken section of fence near his barn, his phone rang with a stern, automated message. A recorded voice stated, "This is a final notice. You must schedule a formal inspection of your property within 48 hours, or we will initiate foreclosure proceedings for unpaid dues." The threat was clear. If he didn't bow to their demands, they would seize his property by force. Dustin calmly recorded the call and replied, "I will only permit an inspection if it is conducted by legally authorized officials and after proper notice. I will not be intimidated by extortionate tactics." His measured reply was a clear signal that he was ready to fight. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating among local farmers. Several confided that they, too, had received similar notices, warnings for non-conforming farm aesthetics, and threats of fines that made no sense. One neighbor, an elderly man with decades of experience in farming, admitted that he'd been harassed over the color of his barn's trim. It became evident that Kerren's tactics were not isolated. They were part of a systematic abuse of power aimed at extorting money from those who simply didn't fit into a cookie-cutter mold. Determined to get to the bottom of this corruption, Dustin began installing security cameras around his property. Every morning he reviewed the footage, noting the times when unauthorized inspectors appeared and when mysterious vehicles parked near the boundary. He also gathered copies of all the communications from the HOA and compared them against local laws. It was soon clear that the HOA's claims were fabricated, designed solely to coerce him into paying dues for an organization he'd never joined. One day, during an informal chat at a local feed store, a disillusioned former board member confided in Dustin, "Kerren has been funneling money from these bogus fines into her own pocket. None of this is above board." I've seen records that don't add up." This revelation added a new dimension to Dustin's fight. It wasn't just about protecting his property. It was about exposing a corrupt system. Fueled by these developments, Dustin reached out to other affected property owners. Over cups of coffee at the local diner, they exchanged stories of similar harassment and discussed strategies to challenge the HOA's authority. Dustin's community blog became a forum for these conversations, and soon a petition demanding an investigation into the HOA's practices circulated widely. Every piece of evidence, screenshots, recorded phone calls, security footage, was carefully cataloged and added to Dustin's dossier. His argument was bolstered by citations from local zoning laws that clearly stated his property was exempt from any HOA control. As the dossier grew, so did the resolve of the community. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out now found strength in solidarity. By the end of the week, Dustin's case was undeniable. The extortionate claims, the fabricated fines, and the unauthorized inspections were all part of a deliberate attempt to force him into submission. And with every new piece of evidence, his determination to expose the HOA's corruption deepened. The battle lines were drawn, and the fight to protect his family's legacy and his right to independent farming was well underway. One crisp morning, as golden sunlight bathed the fields of Thompson Farm, Dustin was met with an unprecedented sight. Two large, rented trucks bearing the HOA's logo were parked at the edge of his property. Out stepped a small team of uniformed enforcers, armed with clipboards, measuring tapes, and aggressive expressions. Their mission was clear: to remedy Dustin's nonconformity by imposing the HOA's arbitrary rules on his land. At the head of the group stood Kerren Baxter, her face set in a determined scowl. "Mr. Miller," she declared loudly, "if you do not immediately pay the alleged dues and provide the necessary documentation, we will initiate foreclosure proceedings on your property." Her voice carried over the fields, leaving little doubt that she intended to use the legal system as a weapon. Dustin stepped forward without hesitation. "I've told you before, I'm not a member of your HOA. My farm is governed by local agricultural and zoning laws, not your arbitrary rules. I will not pay any dues to an organization I never joined, and I certainly won't let you foreclose on my property over fabricated charges." A murmur rippled among the assembled onlookers, neighbors and fellow farmers who had come to witness this confrontation. Some began recording the event on their smartphones. Kerren's enforcers exchanged uneasy glances, while Kerren herself tried to maintain her composure. "The rules are for everyone in this district," she insisted, "and noncompliance will have consequences." Dustin, remaining calm, produced a printed copy of the relevant municipal codes and property rights legislation. According to Section 9.2 of the local ordinance, my property is not subject to HOA jurisdiction. Your claims of unpaid dues are baseless, and any attempt to foreclose on my farm is illegal. His tone was resolute, and the clarity of his words cut through the tension. As the standoff continued, more neighbors gathered. A local rancher shouted, "Our land is ours to manage. No one can force us to pay extortion fees." The public outcry grew louder, emboldening Dustin further. In that moment, he realized that his fight wasn't just about his own rights. It was about protecting the freedoms of every independent property owner in the area. Later that morning, Dustin organized a community meeting at the county fairgrounds. There, he presented his dossier, complete with copies of the HOA notices, security footage of the unauthorized inspections, and legal documents proving his exemption from the HOA's jurisdiction. "This is our community's collective right," he declared before a packed room of supportive farmers and residents. "We will not let an entitled bully foreclose on our land over fictitious dues." The meeting was met with resounding applause and a call for collective action. Neighbors pledged to support Dustin and to challenge the HOA's overreach through formal channels. The unity of the community was palpable, and for the first time, Kerren's tyrannical power seemed to be waning. That afternoon, as Dustin drove his tractor along the boundary of Thompson Farm, he felt a surge of determination. His defiant stand had not only protected his farm, it had sparked a movement among independent landowners. The battle was far from over, But with every word he spoke and every piece of evidence he presented, he was turning the tide against an organization that had long abused its power. As the community's defiance grew, Kerren Baxter became increasingly desperate. Determined to regain control, she decided to take one last drastic step. Early one cold morning, as mist hovered over the fields, Kerren arrived at Thompson Farm with an entourage of compliance officers and legal papers in hand. Her latest demand was even more intrusive than before. "Mr. Miller, you must hand over your house keys immediately so that we can conduct a full inspection of your property and verify your dues. Failure to do so will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings." Dustin met her at the farmhouse door, his face calm but eyes blazing with resolve. "I'm sorry, Kerren," he said steadily, "but I will not give you my keys. My property is my private domain, governed by law, not by your extortion." Infuriated by his unwavering refusal, Kerren's composure shattered. "You leave me no choice," she screamed. In a moment of sheer desperation, she whipped out her phone and dialed 911. "This is an emergency," she shouted into the receiver. "I'm witnessing noncompliance that endangers community standards. I demand immediate police intervention." Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance as police cars pulled up to the farm. Neighbors, already recording on their phones, watched in stunned silence as uniformed officers approached the door. One officer asked, "Ma'am, do you have any legal authority to demand keys from a homeowner?" Kerren, red-faced and flustered, stuttered, I have the HOA guidelines." Her words faltered under the officer's calm scrutiny. Meanwhile, one of the compliance officers was captured on one of Dustin's security cameras sneaking around the side of the farmhouse, a clear breach of privacy and an illegal act. Dustin later retrieved the footage, which would prove crucial. At the ensuing HOA meeting, Dustin wasted no time in presenting the damning video and all related documentation. The room fell into a heavy silence as the evidence of Kerren's abuse was laid out. The 911 call, the unauthorized attempts to seize keys, and the footage of officers and compliance staff overstepping their bounds. "This," Dustin declared, "is proof that your tactics are not only unethical, they are illegal. You cannot bully independent property owners into submission with fabricated dues and baseless threats." The crowd erupted in murmurs and applause. It was clear that Kerren's final, desperate move had backfired spectacularly. Her call to 911, meant to intimidate, instead exposed her as an extortionist and an abuser of power. In the wake of Kerren's disastrous move, the community rallied like never before. What had started as an isolated extortion attempt had snowballed into a full-scale rebellion against an HOA that had no jurisdiction over independent farms. An emergency town meeting was convened at the county auditorium, and the turnout was overwhelming. Farmers, families, and local residents united in their resolve to reclaim their rights. Dustin took the stage, his dossier of evidence laid out for all to see. "We are not members of your HOA," he declared passionately. "Our land is governed by our heritage and the law. Kerren's attempt to foreclose on our farms over unpaid dues is nothing more than a sham designed to extort money from hardworking people." One by one, residents shared their own experiences. Baseless fines for nonconforming aesthetics, intrusive inspections, and absurd demands that had no legal basis. The room was filled with anger and a collective determination to end the tyranny of an overreaching HOA. Under the mounting pressure of public outcry and undeniable evidence, several board members, disillusioned by Kerren's authoritarian tactics, voted unanimously to remove her as HOA president. The news spread like wildfire. Local media outlets ran headlines such as "HOA tyranny toppled," "Kerren Baxter ousted," and "Community unites against foreclosure scam." Within days, the county launched an investigation into the HOA's practices. Financial records revealed that Kerren had been pocketing fines for her own benefit, and internal emails confirmed a systematic abuse of power. The legal and public pressure forced the HOA to cease all foreclosure proceedings against Dustin's farm and those of other independent property owners. For Dustin, watching the institution crumble was both bittersweet and deeply satisfying. Thompson Farm, once the target of extortion, now stood as a proud symbol of independence and resistance. Neighbors who had lived in fear of arbitrary fines now celebrated their newfound freedom, and the community began rebuilding a system based on transparency and mutual respect. As the scandal unfolded, local authorities moved swiftly to hold the old HOA accountable. In a series of high-profile court hearings, the extensive dossier compiled by Dustin, complete with video footage, emails, and sworn testimonies, became the cornerstone of a class-action lawsuit filed on behalf of all affected property owners. City officials imposed substantial fines on the HOA for unlawfully attempting foreclosure on properties outside their jurisdiction, and several former board members were charged with fraud and embezzlement. The legal proceedings were swift and uncompromising. Judges ruled that the HOA's practices were not only unethical but illegal. Headlines blared community triumph, HOA extortion exposed, and unlawful foreclosure attempt leads to massive fines. Local media covered the story extensively, and the public support for independent property owners soared. In a final symbolic gesture of accountability, the newly reformed HOA board, composed entirely of community-elected representatives, vowed to dismantle the archaic policies that had allowed Kerren's reign. They immediately set about drafting a new charter that enshrined transparency, fairness, and the absolute right of every homeowner to manage their own property free from extortion. For Dustin and his neighbors, the legal victory was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law. His efforts had not only saved his farm, but it also paved the way for a future where arbitrary rules and unauthorized foreclosures were a thing of the past. While the legal and communal backlash rained down on the old HOA, Kerren Baxter's personal life unraveled in tandem. Once seen as the iron-fisted enforcer of community standards, she soon became the subject of scathing headlines and bitter social media commentary. Reports detailed her fraudulent practices and the extortionate fines she had levied against independent property owners. It emerged that much of her lavish lifestyle had been funded by misappropriated fines, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the community. Within days of her removal from office, former allies and board members distanced themselves from Kerren. Public opinion turned sharply against her, and rumors of mounting legal fees and financial ruin began to circulate. In a final twist of poetic justice, Kerren attempted to secure a new position in property management. But when she arrived for her first day at a reputable firm known for its ethical standards, her presence was met with incredulous stares and derisive whispers. A co-worker remarked dryly, "I hope you like following orders, because that's all you'll be doing now." For Dustin and the community, Kerren's downfall was the ultimate vindication, a cautionary tale of how unchecked entitlement and abuse of power eventually lead to ruin. Her tactics, once used to intimidate others, had become her undoing, and she was now a pariah in the very community she once tried to control. Months after the dramatic showdown, the landscape of the community had transformed. Thompson Farm, once under threat of an unlawful foreclosure, now stood proudly among other independent properties, a beacon of resilience and the triumph of freedom over tyranny. The oppressive shadow of the old HOA was gone, replaced by a spirit of unity and mutual respect. On a crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped low behind the fields and cast a warm glow over the countryside, Dustin Miller sat on the farmhouse porch enjoying a rare moment of calm. Neighbors strolled by, exchanging friendly greetings and laughing over old grievances that now seemed like distant memories. In a final playful act of defiant humor, a longtime friend approached Dustin carrying a handmade HOA violation notice, printed on brightly colored paper. The notice read, "Violation, excessive independence. Penalty, eternal freedom." Dustin chuckled and shook his head. "They really tried," he murmured, echoing the rallying cry that had united the community in its fight against tyranny. The simple joke wasn't merely a reminder of past battles. It was a celebration of a hard-won victory, a testament to the fact that when people stand together, even the most entitled bullies cannot prevail. As twilight deepened and stars began to twinkle over the open fields, the sound of friendly chatter and laughter filled the air. The legacy of Thompson Farm and the triumph over an overreaching HOA would live on as a beacon of freedom for generations to come. With a satisfied smile, Dustin leaned back in his chair, content in the knowledge that his farm, and his right to live free, had been defended with courage, unity, and the unwavering belief in justice. Fade to black.